good evening, everyone, to this evening's talk. This is about the Battle of Britain. It's about the significance of the Battle of Britain and why it matters to us today, and why we're going to be covering it right now. It is, of course, the Battle of Britain Day, which is why we've got this evening's lecture, but it's also, of course, the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Britain, and it's been a summer of anniversaries. We talk about it being an odd year this year. It was supposed to be a year that was full of anniversaries and full of acknowledging and recognising the men and women who have fought and served this country in the Second World War. Now, Ajax is an association which has endeavoured, despite lockdown, to try and still bring you some of the understanding and to bring to the community some of the recognition of our thanks for the service those who served during the Second World gave. We have, throughout lockdown, still tried to ensure that we are engaged with those anniversaries and still recognising the significant role that so many people played in this, that the community played, but also Britain as a whole during the Second World War and its significance and importance as one of the key allies that defeated Nazism. Now, the Battle of Britain, it's an interesting title because, of course, the thing about the Battle of Britain, it starts at the very end of July in 1940. The war doesn't end until 1945. So why is the Battle of Britain so significant? Why does it matter so much? So let's unpick a little bit of it. And the background, as we all know here, nobody's telling, the war started in September 1939 when Germany had invaded Poland, and the response across Europe and the world was one of condemnation. And many of the countries of Western Europe had, of course, declared war on Germany as a result of that attack on Poland. The method of the attack on Poland, though, was quite significant because what had started the attack had been what became termed as a blitzkrieg, a lightning war, a lightning attack. And why that was so significant was the fact that the Second World War was the first war where air power had taken on this very important initial role. The First World War had seen really the key development of aircraft. Some of you will have known that I've said previously that one of the things that's so significant about the Second World War, about the First World War, was that at the start in 1914, the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service had approximately 200 aircraft between them. And by the end of the First World War in 1918, they had 20,000 aircraft. And that's because aircraft technology were very much a key factor of the outcome of the First World War. We tend to concentrate on the sacrifice, the loss, but actually technology was one of the key outcomes as well. And in the intervening sort of 20 years that followed the end of the First World War to the Second World War, one of the key factors of that change, one of the areas that had made such a significant difference, had been air power. And that involved the speed capability of aircraft, but also the ability to fly, to attack, to think strategically about aircraft in a manner that hadn't been done in previous ways. So when Germany had attacked Poland in 1939, it had led by the air. It had led with this massive aerial attack, destroying facilities on the ground and destroying air defences, ready for the land invasion. And of course, that then became the pattern of attacks across Europe. And what had happened in the spring of 1940 is there had been this attack on Western Europe by Nazi Germany, and it almost been like a domino effect in terms of the way the countries are toppled. The Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, all these countries found themselves on the end of an attack from Germany, which followed the same pattern. A huge aerial assault that destroyed air defences, that destroyed ground facilities, that sent the civilian populations into hiding, into chaos, then a really strong ground attack. At the fall of France in May 1940 had indicated very much, of course, that the next country in Western Europe that was going to be a target for the Germans was, of course, Britain. And everybody in the UK was expecting such an attack. Now, the Germans themselves hoped that the destruction that they had landed across Europe would mean that actually they would be able, in fact, to talk, perhaps see for peace, with the British. They hoped that the Germans had hoped perhaps that there didn't need to be a huge attack on Britain. Of course, British leadership had changed. There was many in Britain who in 1940, having seen the devastation, of course, that Germany had wreaked across Western Europe and of course on Poland. I mean, there have been plenty of images that had come out of Poland in the open when it had first been attacked. There have been plenty of images coming out of Western Europe. And of course, there was also a huge contingent of British soldiers who had seen the German attack across France. There were a number of people who had left from those countries, refugees arriving on British soil, who were able to attest to the severity of the German invasion. So there were plenty in the UK who were perhaps less keen to engage on a full war, and were thinking that maybe some offers to end it there were preferable. The British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, of course, had no such plans. He had been talking about the German threat for many years and was quite determined now that he was in a position of authority that things were going to change. And so what I want us to have a think about now is the significance of that particular decision making. Having all overtures towards a peaceful reconciliation being ignored or pushed back, what we then find is that the Germans do push forward with their planned attack onto Britain. And we can divide the Battle of Britain up into a number of stages. Historians vary between 3 or 4 stages, depending on how you want to divide up the calendar. But we know that really the attack starts on the 10th of July, 1914. As we say, the method of the attack was no surprise. Not only did it follow the pattern that had occurred across the rest of Europe, what had been particularly, of course, important was the fact that Britain was an island. It was detached from the rest of Europe in a geographical sense. And that meant any invasion was going to be more problematic than perhaps had been on the rest of Europe, and certainly from the German position. But in particular, it meant that this time round, the Germans had to try and work out a way that they were going to attack Britain that would ensure as much success in the early stages. Now, the Royal Navy was still considered the best navy in the world in 1940. So any kind of amphibious attack was going to be difficult. It was going to be risky. And so the Germans put together a very similar plan of attack that they had done before, which was a massive aerial assault, a blitzkrieg, that would then be followed by a further attack over the sea and onto land. And the first part of what makes the Battle of Britain so significant is how technology, not just in the air, but on the ground, made a difference. This is part of Britain's early radar system. Now, radar had been in development as part of various tests from during the 1920s, 1930s. There'd been limited success in the early days, but of course, as things had gone on, it had become a little bit more successful. And the RAF had helped fund some of these tests. Other organisations had helped fund some of these tests. And really what we start seeing by the 1930s is the really strong development of early radar technology. as I say, the Air Ministry first set up the committee, the Scientific Survey of Air Defence, in 1934, with a number of key scientists involved, and they were looking at how radio waves could be used for spotting aircraft. And this is quite important because being able to spot aircraft, being able to detect the early stages of an attack were quite important, would be key in being able to defend Britain. So the use of an early warning system, so to speak, could make all the difference. And how radar works is a radio wave is sent out. If it hits something, the signal or wave bounces back, and so detection of radio echo indicates that something was coming towards the place where the wave was first sent. And these are the towers that send out those waves and then bring them back. Now, anybody familiar with films and TV thinks of radar on a screen as being circular. How the waves were detected were on a screen that looks much more like a sort of a heart monitor. And these towers would send out these waves, and then they would detect the wave as it came back. That in turn would be put through the system to work out the speed, the impact, how quickly it had come back. And this was part of a system all along the British coast known as chain home. And chain home ran from 1939, and it was able to detect sort of low-flying aircraft combined with spotter stations was the earliest form of defence. And this was absolutely essential because, again, one of the advantages of being an island had meant that actually not only was aerial attack important, but there was also a limit, or should we say, there was always a time fraction which indicated how long the attack would coming. It's not like you were crossing a border region. You know, it took 30 minutes, approximately 20 minutes to get across the channel. And that enabled those in Britain to have certain time factors on their side, very limited time factors, very restricted time factors, but it did allow these time factors to play a part. And so by having these radar stations that sent out these waves, how it would operate was that the waves would come back. The operators would look at the screens, and they would have to, from that wave come back, they would be able to work out if the wave had simply disappeared, if it hit France, or if it hit something in between France and Britain. Now, all that the early radar does is pick up. If it hits something, that hitting something could be a flock of birds. It could be one aircraft, it could be 100 aircraft, and being able to distinguish between those sort of minor points was not always easy. Nonetheless, that's what was expected to do as those who had to work in the operations room of the early radar system. But it made a massive difference to Britain, because what the radar system was able to do was allow Britain to start putting its planning into operation. So I'm just trying to move the screen along. We seem to have got a flaw here. There we are. So here we have of the RAF looking at the operational screens, and what we have on the right is the chain home command. So that we see that system going there. Now, what that operator is having to do is, from the screen, from previous tests, what they're doing here in 1940 is that she is trying to work out whether or not there is something coming in. And how they do this is, if you imagine a heart barometer with the blip going up, part of that is trying to work out the speed at which that blip is going. Now, birds don't travel quite so fast as aircraft, so that might be a factor. And to try and work out, therefore, whether or not what is coming across the channel is something of significant danger. And that's what that operator there is doing. And that is a very big task, because if something is detected, there is now a time where the time to get the job done is hugely restricted. And that's because of the rest of the system that needs to be operational at this moment. And what we have here is the sort of organizational structure of how it all works. So we can see at the top of the screen, we've got the radar units and the chain home. Now, that young woman there who was looking at her screen to detect the early radar, there are also spotters out. We can see them out on the peripheries of this particular chart. And what's happening is she is trying to work out from the speed at which that blip is going across whether or not it is a flock of seagulls or if it is indeed an enemy attack. She has a matter of seconds to work this out, to make that decision, because that call then has to go into the filter center at Bentley Priory. From there, what they will then have to do is make the next decision about whether or not there's attack. Now they will go out to the coastal observer groups and check whether or not the spotters are seeing anything, and then they will start making their decision. Now, the downside of radar is that once the aircraft comes over land, they are no longer on the radar system. The radar only looks out at this point across out of Britain, across over the sea. But you've got your coastal observation group, and you've also got now your internal observer group. So now you've got quite literally men and women with binoculars checking this information. So the information comes in from the radar units. It goes into the filter center at Bentley Priory. There it will go to the operations center, and then they will decide where the responses are going. Now, this is the bit that's absolutely crucial. I've probably spent more time explaining that to you than they would have had to make the decision, because it takes 20 minutes to scramble the aircraft and get them up in the air, going in the right direction, going out to meet the German aircraft. With that in mind, if it takes 30 minutes to get across the channel and into southeast of England, it takes 20 or so minutes to scramble the aircraft up and out to meet the Germans as they come over land, then essentially from the second of detection through to that, you have anything between 4 to 10 minutes, absolute maximum, to make the decision that what you see on the radar screen is an attack, to get through to the filter center at Bentley Priory, and from there for them to make their decisions. So they only have about between 4 and 6 minutes, possibly 10 at a push, to make those decisions in order for the British or Allied aircraft based in Britain to be operationally in the air to meet the German attack. So this system that you're seeing on the screen was absolutely essential. It was one of the most effective ways of combating what was happening, was by having this particular Dowding system, and it was called the Dowding system after the Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, who was the Commander-in-Chief of the RAF Fighter Command, and he was the one who put together this particular structure, and it all came out of Fighter Command at Bentley Priory. Now, the most air groups that were most likely to be operational, of course, those in the south of England, although the entire country was, of course, divided up into different locations as to how to respond. But because of where the German attack was coming from the air bases, quite often in France itself, now that France was occupied, because of that, it was predominantly the the crews in the south of England who would do most of this work. It was, of course, an enormous task. Let's not underestimate this. This was a huge operation, and sorry, my screen has stuck again. I don't know why. And so, use a different screen. There we are. And this was a huge operation that involved huge amounts of people. Now, one of the things that we often do when we talk about the Battle of Britain is we focus very much on the pilots, who of course will do an enormous job, and will quite literally risk life and limb to be able to stop this German invasion. But it was, it took a lot of people working very hard. And what we have here is one of the images from the plotting rooms. Everything in those days was done by hand. It is not done digitally. As I say, don't think of radar as being something technical in the way that we think of it now. It was something very simplistic. It worked very well. It was hugely successful, but it was not the sophisticated digital operations we would have today. The technology we have in our phone is more than they had throughout the entire war at their fingertips. So everything, a lot of the time, was done very manually. And so what you see here are the women as plotters. And you'll see over their heads, they've got headsets. They are receiving throughout any kind of attack, they are receiving information from all of the outreach stations, from the observation posts, from the air defense posts, from other aircraft areas. They are all the time getting this information through and moving on a very physically large board, a large table, the sites of who is where. They are following the British squadron route, they are following the German squadron route. And because they are doing that, the gentlemen behind them, they are able to calculate where the squadron should be, where they have to be. I mean, once you're in the air is a big place. They've got to pin down where these German aircraft are in order to stop them from any kind of attack. So having the communication, having people understand the importance of their job, having people listen throughout and be able to work out where everybody should be was an enormous endeavour. And of course, it's not just people in the plotting room. It's not just people carrying out their work in the air. You've got these gentlemen across the country working out, keeping their eyes peeled, seeing what is happening, so that eventually what you've got is airborne squadrons. And these are the men who will become known as the few. They will find themselves in long and difficult air battles. One of the things about the pilots of the RAF, and certainly in 1940, is a lot of them are still quite young. I mean, we look at this picture, and of course, the fashions have changed, but a lot of these men will have only been in their 20s. They will fly very, very long hours. Many of them were living off adrenaline to be able to do what they did, and they were flying aircraft that we now are sort of household names: Spitfire, Hurricane, which sound very exciting, and which of us hasn't seen a fly past and thought they looked amazing. But these aircraft they're much better than the generations of aircraft that had come before them, are still relatively simplistic. The Hurricane is metal with stretched canvas over it. It's, these are not the most sophisticated of aircraft that we would see today. So, they are risking their life in a difficult battle, in a difficult circumstances, in aircraft that are, although now famous and extremely capable, were not the most technologically advanced. So all the more reason that to recognise the huge endeavour that these men do. Now, the battle itself can be broken down a lot of the time into 3 stages, which is, I said at the start, is how it's often done. And those stages roughly go from 4 stages, should I say, roughly go from the 10th of July to the 12th of August. And that's when the Luftwaffe were attacking sites mainly along the British coast and ships in the English Channel by dropping their bombs. They were getting ready to ensure that there would be no resistance when they started the amphibious attack of Operation Sea Lion. And that's really what they're trying to do. They're trying to make sure that had helped stop some of that. And enough of the British aircraft were being able to scramble, get up in the air and get to the coast to stop some of that. We see from the 13th to the 18th of August, the second stage, and that's when the Germans started to focus much more on bombing raids on the British airfields. It said, a number of historians, James Holland has said that actually one of the big problems that the Germans faced is they didn't recognize how important radar was. They hadn't really grasped what radar was doing to their attack. And as such, although they may have targeted various bits of radar stations, they weren't the kind of targets that, or they weren't as important by the German standards as some of the other places. Now that meant a number of commentators said that actually only one radar station was significantly damaged during the German attack. They did, however, very much target the British airfields, and that made a huge difference, because that affected the British capability in terms of the number of aircraft they had, but it also affected the ground crew. And these are the men and the women who were absolutely essential in ensuring that the aircraft was operational, that the airfields were useful, that there was the right kind of equipment, that the pilots could just go on and do their job. And so the attack on the airfields itself was really hard. And that also made another factor of this conflict important. Now, we talk about these few, and they are all men. You can look at them. We've seen in other pictures the role of women, but women were not allowed in frontline roles. They were not allowed to be pilots, but they were allowed to work in the air transport service. And throughout the Battle of Britain, throughout the Second World War, the air transport service, which has women as part of its contingent, a number of female pilots are working in the ATS, air transport system, and they are flying and they will be air transport auxiliary, and they are flying aircraft across the UK from factories to airfields. And the ATA are not defended, they do not carry weapons, and therefore they're not considered combatants. This is a civilian service. But it was a hugely risky one, because they are transporting aircraft that could come under fire by the Germans. And their role that the ATA played was hugely significant, because without them flying the aircraft up and down the country, there would not have been sufficient aircraft to be able to ward off this German attack, because the Germans were busy trying to destroy the airfields. 19th of August and 6th of September, we see stage 3. And now at that point, the Luftwaffe start paying more attention to some of the non-military industrial sites, and they start to bomb some of the towns and the cities. This point is when they start really pushing beyond the southeast of England. We start seeing attacks in the southwest, the Midlands, the northeast. And that means that the other areas of the country, 10 group, 11 group, 12 group, which are in the Midlands, 13 group, which are up in the north of England, that's how the country's divided up, they will start now also entering into the battle far more frequently. And we'll start seeing this being much more of a kind of UK and a nationwide defence. It's during this period, on the 20th of August, that Winston Churchill makes his famous speech, where he talks about the fact that never in the field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few. And that's because now the pace is really on. Pilots' training time has been cut from 6 months down to 2 weeks in some cases. And that's not to say people who had no aircraft, these had to be people who looked like they could handle a machine, but it made a really big difference. So that by the time you get to stage 4, which is 7th of September to the 31st of October, it really becomes an intense aerial battle. And this is the thing that makes this battle one of the things that makes it so significant. It is the first aerial battle that has ever occurred in this way. You know, flight is at this point under 40 years old. Therefore, the idea that a battle would be led completely in the air would have been utterly incomprehensible to even those 20 years earlier, never mind 30 or 40 years older. In stage 4, the Germans are now targeting absolutely the cities with mass bombing raids. And really, this is when we start talking about the Blitz starting, lightning starting. And today is the 80th anniversary of what we call Battle of Britain Day, because on the 15th of September 1940, it was one of the heaviest bombing raids launched against Britain, in particular London. And the RAF Fighter Command continued to attack the Luftwaffe. And it also turned out to be one of the days where the Germans suffered huge losses. The Germans did manage to damage airfields and factories, but not enough to stop. And the radar stations, I say, suffered very little in the end. And it's at this point we start seeing the fact that the Germans changed their mind, led by Hitler. They changed their mind on an attack on Britain in terms of Operation Sea Lion, and they're no longer going to invade. Instead, what they're going to do is they're going to turn to the night raids on British cities, and in an attempt to exhaust and reduce British public opinion for the war. We start seeing that change very much there. But why again is this significant? Well, it's significant because radar is important. It shows the way that technology can give people an advanced understanding of what is happening. It can help people have, where they might appear to have a smaller air force, technology can give you an advantage over numbers, and that is important. It is significant because it shows the general determination that Britain had to remain part of this conflict and to repel a German advance. You know, Germany was very sure that it would get some kind of treaty with Britain, and this demonstrated that that simply wasn't going to happen. Why is it significant? Well, it's one of the most diverse battles that had ever been fought in this way. The diversity in the air was absolutely enormous. When Germany had invaded the countries across Europe, many of those nations, if they could, had tried to get some of their air crews out. In the end, there are 16 nations represented in the squadrons of the RAF that take part in the Battle of Britain. 1/5 of Fighter Command's aircrew came from overseas. There's 126 New Zealanders, 98 Canadians, 33 Australians, 25 South Africans participated. There's also 3 Rhodesians, a Jamaican, a Barbadian, and Newfoundlander. The Commonwealth countries produced some of the best fighter pilots, but it wasn't just them perhaps that were the most famous. The ones who perhaps had the most of the axe to grind were those who came to Britain after the fall of France and the Western Europe collapse. In all, 145 Poles served, and we'll come to them again in a minute, but also 88 Czechoslovakians, 29 Belgians, 13 Frenchmen, and an Austrian all flew in the Battle of Britain. They wanted to do their bit. They wanted to stop the Nazis dominating all of Europe. The Polish contribution in particular came from 302 and 303 Squadron. They had an absolute determination and grit, was just really quite amazing. They did not have the aircraft to stop the Luftwaffe when the Germans had invaded Poland. They did not necessarily have the experience at that point, but the Polish air crews, and that included air crew, not just pilots, who came to Britain, were possibly some of the most determined of those willing to fight. What they did have, what the Czechoslovakians had, what the French had, what the Belgians had, was they had experience of fighting the Germans in the air. Now, they knew what it meant to lose, and they knew what it meant to fight against the German tactics. And that's what made them some of the best of the fighters. And in fact, the most successful squadron during the Battle of Britain is 303 Squadron. And by success, it depends how you want to measure these things, but certainly at that point, the success was measured in the number of kills. And 303 Squadron killed the most of Germans in that attempt to dominate Britain. There were approximately 3,000 pilots who took part in the battle overall, but there were significantly more who also served on the ground, who served in fighter command and served in many different ways in the factories as plotters and as spotters. The RAF lost about 1,000 aircraft during the Battle of Britain, and the Luftwaffe lost 1,887. So by far, the higher losses were felt by the Germans. Of the 3,000 aircrew fought in the Battle of Britain, 544 lost their lives, and the remainder, a further 814, died before the end of the war. That is absolutely devastating statistics. Far, far more German aircrews were killed, though, than British. And that's the kind of thing that tipped the odds. One of the things that's said by a number of historians about the Battle of Britain was it did a number of things. It made Hitler rethink how powerful his air service was. It made him rethink the use of aircraft. Now, that's a good thing, because as the war will progress, that means less significance is put on the aircraft by the Germans, as perhaps Britain and the other allies are doing. It meant that actually a substantial number of German pilots had been killed, and it would take a long time to train from a small pool of people to get them back up to an ability where they would be capable of the kind of fighting that was required in the air that Britain had experienced during the Battle of Britain. After all, Germany can only recruit from Germany, from Austria, and from a small pool of allies. The majority of the countries that it dominates across Europe are not providing aircrew for the Luftwaffe. And so there is a limit to how many pilots they can recruit, train, and get capable. Britain, on the other hand, has the Allies, has the Commonwealth, has the Empire, and as the war progresses, it will also have the US. So this makes a difference in terms of capabilities, confidence in the future. And this is probably the other significant part of this, of why this battle matters. It matters because this is the first time that Germany, Nazi Germany, experiences defeat. For all its might and strength, for all the fact that it had seemed to march across Europe, it had failed to dominate the last of the Western European countries. It had failed to take Britain out of the game. And that had huge repercussions, because Britain itself, the UK, might not seem very big. But more importantly, Britain and its empire was huge. And if you took Britain out, if the Germans had taken Britain out, they would have taken out all those resources. By Britain remaining in the conflict, by Britain continuing to meet the Germans in their attack, they were able to stall German confidence. Britain had the support of its empire, it had the support of the Commonwealth, it was able to get resources in, it was able to continue to defend, it was able to eventually look at offensive conflict. But most importantly, it had been an absolute blow to German confidence, whilst at the same time it had been a huge morale boost, not just to Britain, but to the rest of Europe. The idea that the Nazis had been defeated, and they had been defeated in the air, where they had felt so confident, was a huge morale boost for many of the populations across Europe who only months before had felt themselves under the boot of Germany. And here we see the men of the Polish 303 Squadron. How happy they must be to be able to take the fight back to the Germans, having seen their own country crushed. Now, to bring it to Ajax and a little bit to why we're remembering this today, well, what we do know, what are the stats do we know about the Jewish community? What do we know? Well, we know that Jews served in the Battle of Britain. We know that they served as pilots. We know that they served as aircrew. We know that there were female plotters. We know that there were women working in the radar stations. We know this information, and we understand the significance it is to have that participation. We know that 20,000 Jews will serve in the RAF over the course of the Second World War, and approximately 900 of them will be killed. We know that some of them will receive the DSC, the Distinguished Flying Cross. We know that many of them will be injured. We know that many of them will not recover from this war, but we know that many will. We know that as a community, we were overrepresented in many ways in the forces because of that determination of not just British Jewry, but the Jews who would come in from across Europe who wanted to be able to stop Nazi Germany. And this was the first battle that showed that Germany could be stopped. Now, the war will rage, as we know, for another 5 years. It's going to be a long, drawn out conflict with, as we are fully aware, millions killed. But this particular battle is a turning point. This particular battle ensured that there were countries still prepared to try and stop Germany. It demonstrated that there was a resistance within the UK to simply give in, and it very much demonstrated globally that the Germans could be stopped in their tracks. And so the significance of the Battle of Britain, the significance of those days 80 years ago, should not be underestimated when we look backwards on how the war affected our lives, but also when we look forward to the strength and security that we have today. And on that note, I will finish this evening's lecture and I will invite questions.